This is the last video, tip of the week, that's going to be about gauge. In the past 2 weeks, we've talked about measuring and marking swatches, counting rows and stitches, and now we're going to do the actual gauge calculation. And I am a functional math idiot, and if I can do this, anyone can. It's very simple math, and I can't stress again how important it is. Now, if you remember, we measured this swatch, and it is 4.125 or 4 1/8 inches wide, and there are 23 stitches, and it is 2.875 inches long or 2 7/8 inches long, and there are 32 rows that we're going to be measuring. Now, how can we use these numbers to get the gauge? Well, to do this, what we want to do is get a calculator, and I'm going to divide the number of stitches, which is 23, and I'm going to divide it by the width, which is 1.125. And that's going to give me this decimal number. This isn't a terribly useful number. This is the number of stitches per inch, and it is a fraction. It's an inch and it's 5.5 basically stitches, which you can't cast that on. You can't work with it. So we need to put it in some kind of format that we can use. Now, the number that most knitters know is the number of stitches over 4 inches. And this is totally arbitrary, the 4 inches. It could be 5 inches, it could be 3 inches. It really has no meaning. But since it's the only consistent thing in knitting, really, we're going to cling to it and use it. So I know I have 5 point something stitches per inch, but again, that's not a useful number to me. So I need to know, for a pattern, say, how many stitches over 4 inches. So I'm going to multiply this number by 4, and that gives me 22.30303. And again, that's not really a number I can work with. Those decimals aren't going to help me out that much, but at this point what I can do is round that off. So I can safely say that I have 22 stitches per inch for over 4 inches. And I can compare that to the gauge statement in the pattern that I'm using. I can, if I'm designing, I can multiply, well actually I can use the number of stitches per inch if I'm designing, but I can look at the ball band and see if the yarn that I want to use is going to work out for my project. This is the number of stitches per inch. Now let's do the number of rows. I have 32 rows, and I'm going to divide that by my length, which is 2.875, and that's going to give me 11 and some decimals. So I get approximately 11 rows per inch. But as with the number of stitches per inch, I'm going to figure out what this is over 4, and I get basically 44.5 rows per inch. Now, notice that I have a 5 there. If I have simple math, I'm going to round up. Anything over 5, I'm going to round up. Anything under 5, I'm going to round down. So I can safely say I have 45 rows over 4 inches. Now, how important is row gauge? Well, unless you're doing cables or lace or something where a pattern depends on a certain number of repeats of the pattern and you have to end at a very specific spot in order for it to look good, row gauge isn't all that important. For garter stitch, which is what this gauge is for, I can always knit more rows or fewer rows to get the measurements. And if you look at patterns, it'll generally say work until the piece measures 14 inches or whatever, and however many rows that takes is however many rows it takes. Stitch gauge, much more important. Now, in the blog itself, I'm going to go ahead and show the calculation for each of these different stitch patterns that I used in the previous week's blogs, so you can see how those go, and we can also make some assumptions about the type of gauge that one normally gets for different types of stitch patterns.